Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the second in our series of 8 live CLAG sessions during the spring semester. I'm really happy to be with you again. Many of you know, I think, that my name is Jim Biles, and this is our second live CLAG session. And we're joined this week by 2 panelists and a moderator. Our 2 panelists are Catherine Nolin from the University of Northern British Columbia and Grahame Russell from Rights Action. And I'm very pleased that they've been able to join us this week. They're going to discuss the root causes of migration from Honduras and Guatemala. And this session is going to be moderated by Rebecca Klauser from Washington University in St. Louis. So I will turn the controls over to Rebecca and sit back and enjoy the discussion. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone who's attending today. As Jim noted, the topic of today's CLAG Live is No End in Sight, Root Causes of Migration from Honduras and Guatemala. Today, our panelists will be discussing how foreign policy, the international community, and transnational corporate interests result in repression, exploitation, and forced migration from Honduras and Guatemala. I'd like to welcome and thank both of our panelists, Catherine Nolin and Grahame Russell, for talking with us today. Catherine Nolin is a professor and chair of the geography program at the University of Northern British Columbia, as well as being the chair of CLAG. She's the author of numerous publications and has received several awards. Her primary areas of research include violence and development in Guatemala and migration, transnationalism, and refugee studies. Grahame Russell is the director of Rights Action, a not-for-profit organization that focuses on development, human rights, disaster relief, and environmental protection, mainly in Guatemala and Honduras. He's also a lawyer and an adjunct professor at the University of Northern British Columbia. They have worked together for 20 years to organize and facilitate field schools to Guatemala for undergraduate and graduate students. And they've recently co-edited the book, Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. The structure for today's session is that our panelists will each speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will have ample time to open it up for discussion. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to them after our panelists have spoken. So again, thank you for being here, Catherine and Grahame, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Jim. Well, I see a lot of people have joined in, so I'm really happy to be here with all of you virtually as we try and fill in some time between our CLAG conferences. We started out, many of us together in Antigua, Guatemala in January of 2020, and several people joined Grahame and I on a post-CLAG conference field trip to Maya Achi territory in and around Rabinao. And we were looking at that time, again, post-genocide community recovery, resilience, moving forward, but also all the challenges faced by survivors of the 1980s genocide. It was a really powerful time, and we really enjoyed having a lot of CLAG participants join us. And we liked it so much that our plan was actually to run 2 more CLAG, Rights Action, UNBC type field trips, and had one planned for May of 2020, which of course then was canceled because of the pandemic, and as was the one we planned for September. So those are in the future. I hope that we can all come together again and do that kind of on the ground work together. But in the meantime, I think these live CLAGs are fantastic and a great opportunity to connect all of us across these spaces. So before we get started, I did want to recognize that I'm coming to you from Prince George, British Columbia in Canada, and I'm on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. And as I did when we opened the whole live CLAG series, I'll ask all of you to kind of reflect on the Indigenous lands from where you're joining us, and that we all see that that kind of acknowledgement is just really one first step in working in action and relationship for deeper possibilities for decolonizing the relationships between people and place. Now, Grahame is going to kick us off. The two of us have worked together, as Rebecca said, for about 20 years, working in Guatemala on all sorts of issues. And it was really in 2004 when we were first kind of asked to start looking at mining issues that were starting to percolate in many of the communities that we worked in. And so it's become an area that of focus for both of us together and separately. And my work long term, and I think reeling back 25 years or so, has been on the issue of refugee movement and forced migration out of the region due to the political violence, social violence, and the genocide that was taking place, and all of the reasons why people fled from the region, ended up in places, of course, like Mexico, the United States, but also Canada. And so we'll be reflecting on that longer term connection in this discussion about the root causes of forced migration that deal with both contemporary issues, but these have longer histories and geographies that we'll be talking about today. So Grahame's going to kick us off with the work that he has been doing for decades as well in both Honduras and Guatemala. And then I'll come in after his 20 minutes or so and again tie it to some of the more current work we're doing with mining affected communities and how that is maybe one focus that we can bring to this broader discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Grahame.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Clegg, for hosting this event, and nice to meet you, Rebecca and Jim, who set the stage, and Catherine, it's always a pleasure to be working with you again. And I appreciate your opening remarks, Catherine, about being on First Nations lands out in Western Canada, and the roots of that go back to before Canada became a nation state, obviously. And the roots of those issues are deeply colonial and imperialist in nature. And I fundamentally borrow that same framework when trying to understand both the past and the present in Central America, where I mainly work, particularly Guatemala and Honduras. And I think in very similar ways to how there's work going on in Canada and the US to decolonize, get a deeper understanding of what is the history of imperialism and how Canada and the United States came to be formed as nation states, and then the colonialist relationships that still exist inside our borders. I think that's that's how the relationships exist today and operate today between rich, powerful countries like Canada and the US and other international actors that I'll refer to, and places like Central America. I think these relationships are still deeply imperialist and colonialist in nature in many ways. I'm not making a direct comparison, but there's many indirect comparisons. And part of the work of trying to understand what are the underlying causes of so many decades, so many generations of people being forced to flee countries like Honduras and Guatemala is to unpack the nature of these very unjust, unequal relationships, both inside their borders, which usually get all the attention, but more importantly for us as Canadian and Americans, between our countries and theirs. And I'm very clear in my own understanding, based on the work I've been doing with Rights Action in Central America for over 30 years, that Canada and the United States are very much part of the problem in Central America. Our policies, our government policies, our private sector policies, our actions, our free trade agreements, our corporate interests, our investor interests, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund are very much part of the problem. And without putting too fine a microscope on the meaning of the words of imperialism and colonialism, these relationships are imperialist and colonialist in many ways, ongoing today. And so when I read in the newspaper and in the media, particularly recently, that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing Honduras and Guatemala, just to focus on those two countries, because people are fleeing many places around the world, they're often referred to as refugee-producing countries, and that on one level is true. But Canadian and US government policies are refugee-producing policies as implemented in those countries. And the US particularly so when you look at their history of militarism in the region. Canadian corporate interests, US corporate interests, are refugee-producing interests in those countries, past and present. World Bank investment policies, Inter-American Development Bank investment policies are refugee-producing policies in those regions. So my initial discussion presentation here is going to be very brief, and I've already sort of told the whole perspective. It's more like an editorial to try and reframe the issues, because in recent years, the issue of caravans of refugees and all the fear-mongering talk of forced migrants, hordes of people, all the demeaning, denigrating, and even racist language that's used to describe so many hundreds of thousands of people trying to get into the US. And at the US border, the vast majority are either from Mexico or Honduras and Guatemala, though they come from a wide range of countries. It's a very timely to discuss this issue. And while there's a raging debate, particularly in the US, about what to do about the forced migrancy, the refugee issue, and some 10 or 11 million undocumented people inside the US, there's almost zero discussion about how our government policies, past and present, particularly the US, but also Canada, how our private sector policies, past and present, are reproducing right now the very conditions in Guatemala and Honduras, in partnership with the elites there, that are forcing people to flee. So even as Biden has changed the language a bit, President Biden, from the racist and denigrating language that was used during the time of President Trump as to what to do with all these hordes of people, there's still no discussion about how, even today, Biden going forward will be implementing policies that will worsen the very conditions that forced people to flee Honduras and Guatemala, even as they're bringing a more humane, a more legalistic approach to how to deal with the people who have been forced to flee in the recent past and previous generations. So while I'm very much in favor of creating a legal path to citizenship in the US for as many people as possible who are already there, and people at the border, getting them a legal process to make their claims as refugee claimants or some other form of migrancy. The bigger issue, the elephant in the room, is the refugee producing conditions in places like Honduras and Guatemala that are bad and getting worse, even as we speak. So I'm just going to briefly reiterate that argument with a few examples and then pass it over to you, Catherine, to give more concrete examples in sort of, amongst other issues, in one sector of the economy, which is that of mining. But when I loosely refer to how Canada and the US are refugee-producing countries ourselves in places like Guatemala and Honduras, more aptly, it should be referred to as this so-called international community, which is, again, yet another very misnamed expression. Because the international community, when I refer to Guatemala and Honduras, I'm referring mainly to the United States as the lead country that has its knee on the neck of Central America, its boot on the neck of Central America. But Canada, in support of US policies and in favor of our own policies, does as well. Certain Western European countries, Spain particularly, do as well. The World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, they're all part of this international community that are implementing policies that are reproducing refugee-producing conditions. And then a whole host of global companies. Rights Action's work in Guatemala and Honduras for the past 3 decades has been to directly support community defense struggles. And the majority of the communities that we support, mainly indigenous, but also non-indigenous, are communities that are fighting to stay on their land and not be violently, forcibly evicted from their land, that are fighting to protect the environment from harm to their local environment, that are fighting to protect their own human rights. In almost every one of these community defense struggles, the common element is the global economy. It's either mining interests that are doing this to them. It's either privatized hydroelectric dam interests that are doing this to them. It's the production of bananas, coffee, sugarcane, African palm that is doing this to them. It is the forcibly removing of Garifuna people from northern Honduras through violence and corruption to get at their lands for tourism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Almost every one of the community defense struggles that Rights Action is supporting is in response to the global economy, the global economic order as it functions. And it's sort of, the key players in that are governments of countries like Canada, the United States, Spain, the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank. The international economic order itself as it operates is a refugee-producing economic order. Anyone who's worked in Central America, particularly Honduras and Guatemala, you almost tear your hair out in rage or cry when you quite literally visualize tens of thousands of Central Americans forced to flee their terrible lands and literally traveling on foot or in buses by the richest lands in both countries that are doing what? They're producing goods for the North American markets. They're producing goods for European markets. The owners of the richest lands in Central America, certainly in Honduras and Guatemala, are either elite economic elites in Honduras and Guatemala working in partnership with importers and exporters, or they're outright owned by foreign entities producing the list of things I just mentioned. And all of that for export to consumers in Canada, the United States, and Europe. That it is a vicious cycle that is completely closed unto itself, and there's no end in sight unless we take this debate much further than what to do about the refugees at the US border to getting at the underlying causes and how international economic policies, military policies are very much part of the problem. And in all of this, I would just highlight another point. This is not a reductionist argument to say that all the ills of Honduras and Guatemala come from outside the country. All of these international actors, the US government, Canadian government, World Bank, IMF, foreign mining companies, et cetera, are doing direct business deals with the undemocratic, racist, economic elites, political elites of Honduras and Guatemala. Those are our partners. So it's not a reductionist argument to say that all the problems come from the outside. Those are our partners. We call them democratically elected governments of Honduras and Guatemala. These are outright lies. If not, it's willful ignorance at best and outright lies at worst. But those are our partners in the region who are helping keep in place this very refugee-producing political, economic, military order. And then over the years, into a discussion like this, as a further sort of editorial comment, the role of US military interventions that do what ultimately? They keep in place those economic, military, political elites in places like Guatemala and Honduras to do what? To keep in place this type of social economic order that reproduces so many refugees. So the coup d'etat in 1954 in Guatemala was specifically to do that, to bring back into power a certain economic, political, military elite to keep in place this type of social economic order. What was the coup in 2009 in Honduras for? For exactly the same thing. And then in the horrific years of the 1970s and 1980s, when the United States was supporting brutal military dictatorships in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, what was the purpose of that? It was to push back and quell and crush and kill social justice movements, indigenous rights movements, union rights movements, and small armed rebel groups that were working against this unjust order, and to keep in place the very same economic, military, political elites that are in power today. And so the past is present throughout this entire last decades, if not generations of history, and the same patterns of people being forced to flee home and country year after year, decade after decade, are reproducing themselves now once again. It may spike for a few years, it may dip down for a few years, but the patterns have not changed one iota going back generations or decades. And I'm going to just finish it off just and what has got me on a bit of a rant on this sort of insisting on this type of reframing of this issue over the past couple of years was President Trump's famous comments a couple of years ago about shithole countries. And that received a fair bit of media attention around the world and was widely criticized. But rightly so. It's a racist, denigrating comment, and it's crass. And there's, what else do you want to say about President Trump and the way he speaks about issues? But the fact is, I believe that's how Canada and the United States treat the people of Honduras and Guatemala, the majority populations of Honduras and Guatemala. I believe that's how we treat cheap labor there. I believe that is how our companies and our economic interests treat the resources there. We want the best lands to produce our own goods, and we will use violence and corruption to get people out of the way. We want the best lands to get the resources that are underneath those lands, and we will use violence and corruption to get the people out of the way. We want the best beach fronts for our tourism interests, and we will use violence and corruption to get the people out of the way, working in concert with the local ruling elites. We are actually treating those places like shithole countries, if you just pardon the crassness of the expression. And I think, and one other sort of comment that gets used a lot and misused a lot is the notion of failed states. So that if and when the issue gets put on the front page and people are left scratching their heads going, well, what can we do about those failed states over there that just can't get their act together, and they keep producing all these refugees that are forced to flee? All of that begs the underlying question. Those are not failed states at all. They are very intentional states. They maintain full economic, military, and economic relations, political relations with the World Bank, the IMF, IDB, a host of global corporations and investment firms, Canadian government, US government. We all maintain full relationships and beneficial relationships with those states, and we know what those states do. And those states are on our behalf and on the behalf of their own economic elites, are reproducing the very conditions that favor global economic interests, global consumer interests, at the expense of the well-being of their own populations. So I'm going to leave it at that, Catherine. I do sign off just sort of stating the obvious that I've made a lot of generalizations here. And while I stand by the arguments I'm making, there's a lot of specific elements that I invite people to sort of ask more specific questions about or cross-examine me about in terms of trying to reframe this discussion in this way. So thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to Catherine's presentation and then some discussion.
Great, thank you, Graham. I am just going to share my screen here. It'll just take me 1 minute. All right, I'm hoping this is going to work. It was working before when we were testing, and I don't see that it's working, Rebecca. I'm going to try one more time. There we go. Good. Great. Can we see the slides, everybody? I'm hoping so. Good. Thanks, Jim. Great. All right. Well, thank you, Graham, for getting us rolling and providing this kind of reframing, the way in which we've tried to understand some of these issues. With this live CLAG, we really wanted to really get some conversation going. And so we're not presenting on any particular research project, but how we see these issues, how we work together and separately on these issues. Myself mainly in Guatemala, Graham in Guatemala and Honduras. And along with the grad students who've worked with us and undergraduates who've worked with us over many years on many of these issues. So as I mentioned, I started my work in Guatemala as a master's student, really looking at refugee movement out of Guatemala into United Nations refugee camps in Mexico. And as I moved into my PhD work, I was more grounded in the Canadian experience of Guatemalan refugees who were resettled or were able to achieve asylum in Canada, which at the time, in the mid 1990s, was about 15,000 or so people. And it was maybe a high point of some of Canada's interactions with the country of Guatemala, receiving refugee individuals and really getting them up to Canada, sometimes within 24 hours, if they could make their way to the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala City. I think that was kind of a high point. There's been a much longer connection in terms of our interest in the natural resources, in particular of this region. But what I wanted to do was connect that, because the work that I followed up with individually and along with Grahame has looked at what has happened since that time, working with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and organizations across the country in this, what has been called a post-genocide reality, the way in which folks are in many ways dealing with the very same conditions, or almost the very same conditions that they were fighting against back in the 70s and 80s. And some of those conditions have actually worsened over time. So the homicide rate, the levels of malnutrition and hunger, the displacement, forced evictions, all of these things have amplified over time. So that, as Grahame mentions, we're seeing both individuals and caravans of people fleeing this region, often called economic migrants, and what I've tried to often call survival migrants, if we're not going to use the sort of legal language of refugees, where many of these people wouldn't be accepted in their claims of asylum, but certainly are fleeing refugee-producing conditions, as Grahame said. So what I wanted to try and do over the next 15 or so minutes is kind of look at this kind of long term to situate it in some of the work we're doing that we've done, again, together and separately and with a lot of students over the last 15, 16 years, looking at Canadian mining interests in this region as really refugee-producing entities. And creating the conditions that people are either fleeing from or trying to figure out a way to live through, survive, and kind of repel, to resist this kind of imposed so-called development model. And so this image here on the bottom is the Canadian owned through Goldcorp, which is based in Vancouver, the Marlin mine, which is now in a sort of a closing phase, though most people think that it might restart again sometime soon. So just to situate this, back in 2004, we had been working on other issues, and yet there were a lot of, there were interests, Canadian mining interests that were just starting to percolate to the surface again. And we were really asked to start looking at this. And so we kind of turned our attention to what was going on. And when we started talking to people across the country and working with organizations on the ground that were community defense struggles, concerned about the natural environment and so on, this map, for example, comes from, this is, I think, a map that we received from Madre Selva back in 2004, 2005, so about that same time, where they were talking and trying to demonstrate that there weren't a whole lot of open active mines, but the requests for reconnaissance, to start scoping things out, to start getting exploitation license, to do some initial testing, start exploring, and then a few that were under exploitation itself. In regions that are mostly Indigenous communities, mostly in mountainous regions, though not all necessarily, but mostly in that band of highland regions where most of the population is Indigenous and where most of the violence was suffered during the genocide. And so people talked about, right, that people were showing up really in new ways, trying to get them off this land. And so what we tried to do over the last 15 years or so, and this is kind of the core of the book that Rebecca had mentioned that we'll have coming out in summertime, focused on 4 main mining struggles in 4 different parts of the country, from the Marlin mine, which I just showed you over in the west near Sipicapa, to the Phoenix mining project, which is kind of the longest term project that used to be owned by Inco, a kind of an old Canadian mining company on the shores of Lake El Estor. Then down towards El Salvador and Honduras, the Escobal mine owned by Tahoe Resources out of Vancouver. And then La Puya, which was a struggle where people are like still on the road in front of, again, a Canadian-owned mining project that eventually became American-owned. What we wanted to do was try and really show through this one industry that not only what was going on, how Canada was implicated in creating these conditions that people were fleeing, or at least resisting, and many people fleeing from, using a range of voices, a range of perspectives, talking to people about this idea of, Canadian companies bringing development to their communities. What we really saw, these are images from James Rodriguez, who we've worked with for many years, Mexican-American documentary photographer. What we really saw is this from the Canadian perspective, what was being called an extractives approach to development. I think the Canadian government has kind of dropped that language now, because that sounds okay in the boardrooms or the government offices in Ottawa. And what we saw on the ground instead were massive violence, the police, military, and private security of companies being employed to violently evict people from lands that companies now had under concession, under control, for exploration and later exploitation, and a complete lack of consultation with communities about this kind of approach to development. And instead, we're told that this was going to bring development to their communities. Back in 2010, we were asked to meet with a community called Lote Ocho up near the Phoenix mine along Lake Isabel. And what we heard around their experience with this Canadian-owned mining company, its Guatemalan subsidiary, in the year 2007. So they were talking to us 3 years later, really for the first time. They brought up their, these issues of what had happened, forced evictions, attacks on the community, helicopter flyovers, 800 police and military and private security, coming into their very remote communities up in the mountains above the lake to get them off that land so that they could start the exploitation of the nickel under their feet. So what I wanted to share with you is very quickly is that kind of started us off on trying to understand our roles as both academics, Grahame with his NGOs, and our graduate students as both witnesses to what we had heard, and which means to kind of hear about this, speak about it, and speak out about it. And so what we kicked off with our students working with us was to bring a formal human rights violation complaint to the Canadian Embassy and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, documenting what people had told us, what we had heard and seen in this region. And that has been kind of what we've done over the last 10, 11 years on these issues, is continue to document these crimes, which has created, more violence in these communities, more people fleeing, a criminalization of people who are trying to defend their communities in the face of this kind of so-called development. And so over the last several years, we organized some emergency delegations to Guatemala to start, again, more, systematically documenting what was going on in these 4 main mining struggles, and bringing along other people with us, journalists, photographers, academics, graduate students, journalists, and so on. And it means sometimes we're in communities, sometimes we're in, the Supreme Court, where some of these decisions about how companies are allowed to operate or not, often to the benefit of the companies themselves. We've tried to document, again, to have the faces of people who are resisting this kind of imposed development and trying to stay in place rather than being forced to flee. So folks like this outside the Escobal mine owned by Vancouver-based Tahoe Resources, which is now owned by Pan American Silver. But they were blocking entrance to the road site as one avenue to say, we have a different vision for our communities, that we are demanding these companies get out of here. And we're demanding that proper consultation happens about what kind of development we're interested in pursuing to try and stem that flow so that there are actual opportunities within their own communities to remain. The Goldcorp Marlin mine, which, as I said, it's up in San Marcos near Sipicapa, now has already run its life and is in a closure phase right now. But again, the most recent visits we had to the communities around this mine site, gold mine, they're very concerned. There's no official closure plans, and so there's a concern that it will restart, as they've also not only done open pit mining, but underground tunneling. I think hundreds of kilometers almost of underground tunnels to get at gold in surrounding communities. Super important to us is talking with community members, people who would identify themselves as part of the resistance to this imposed development, who have a total different vision for what is needed, wanted in their communities. They're also demanding reparations, they're demanding justice, they're demanding accountability, so that, again, we understand that happens both within Guatemala, but also, as Grahame has mentioned, right, in Canada, with our policies that are supporting the Canadian extractive industry operating abroad almost at all costs. All of this work that we've done over the last 10 or 15 years or so has always been brought to the Canadian Embassy. It's always been brought to the companies themselves, to politicians, and so on, as that's been the request of community members to us, to work to get what they call these monsters out of their lands. So more recently, we again went back through all of these communities to document through testimonies, interviews, photographs, and some video interviews, pulling our book together so that we have a range of voices included in this work, in this book that we're calling Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. I think it's really important to hear a range of voices that counter what the corporate social responsibility, I guess, spin of many of these companies that tell Canadians that they're bringing development to this region. And instead, we have folks like Alvarado here, who with his community have blocked the entrance to that site for, well, now more than 6 years of peaceful resistance. I think Nate Einbinder might be on the call. He's one of the graduate students who started with us back in Lote Ocho back in 2010. And with him, we again tried to bring the voices of community members who were asking us to, get these monsters out of their communities so that they could remain in their communities and continue a path that they determined rather than one that was forced upon them. So what we have really identified, I guess, over time is, as Grahame has already mentioned to you, right, that the Canadian government and our companies are choosing to do business in Guatemala in the context of corruption, impunity, lack of democracy, where that's the norm, that they understand that and that they are benefiting from it. And through those partnerships are creating more violence, more corruption, more impunity. And they are creating those conditions, the refugee-producing conditions that we supposedly are, officially trying to stop. Now, I would say both of us would agree that the initial violation really is the lack of free, prior, and informed consent before mining development. That what we're seeing here is transnational impunity. For all of the work we've done over the last so many years, documenting the crimes and violations and health harms, environmental harms, and so on, that almost no one has been held accountable for these crimes. And it's incredibly difficult for that to happen within Guatemala. And it's starting to happen slowly within the Canadian courts. And there are some positive developments on that front that Graham might want to talk about a little bit later. So a few points here. When we think about this one industry, mining extractive industry, that all across Latin America, now this number might change depending on the year, but roughly 70% of the mining companies are Canadian controlled. Most Canadians don't know this. We know that there's a lot of mining industry in Canada. I don't think most people know the global reach of Canadian mining companies and what that means for communities on the ground in those places. What we've seen in many parts of the world is an increased number of killings, of criminalization, of creating those conditions that make it so that life is not sustainable in those communities if you are trying to resist what's happening here. So what we're seeing is this, of course, increased competition for control of land and natural resources, and that Indigenous communities and women in particular in those communities are, that the conditions are made to make them vulnerable to what's going on there. The high rate of killing of environmental activists, community defenders, water defenders have just gone through the roof over the last while. And those are some of the people that we've worked to accompany and to amplify their voices on why, in the face of this kind of violence, that they are still willing to remain and not flee. I wanted to reflect on something that James was quoted, our documentary photographer we work with, back a while ago in the New York Times. And I think this is an important quote to think about when we're talking about the long-term connection here of refugee-producing actions in this region. And one thing James said that resonated with me is that people think the war ended, but the effects of the war are so current. To me, that has been a major push factor in the whole immigration issue. People talk about violence and gangs, which are obviously important, but nobody connects it to the war, which they should. And so what we really tried to do with the work we've done is see Canadian mining and American mining as well. But these are kind of like in a way, the children of the genocide, that the genocide created the conditions that opened up the country to massive foreign investment, opened up so that now really most mining companies sign on to agreements that mean that 99% of mining profits return to the company, 1% remains in the country. And in order to facilitate that, plunder and exploitation, violence is used to make that happen. And many of the tactics are tied to tactics that we would have seen during the genocide. Just to make a couple points about the Canadian context, as I'm coming to you from Canada, that there has been this long-term forced migration to Canada from the time of the genocide, and sanctuary routes were developed all through Mexico and through different parts of the United States to get people up to refuge in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal mainly. But people are spread throughout the whole country who were received as refugees, that their claims, something like 93% back in the 90s were accepted in Canada, while at the same time in the United States, only about 2 or 3% were accepted. So we understood on one level that people were fleeing violence and deserved refuge. Now, many of those very same conditions are at play right now, and it's almost impossible for anybody to arrive in Canada as a refugee from Guatemala. not to say nobody, but almost none. And what I would argue is that Canadians are protected from these forced migrations by our geography. We have the United States and Mexico between us, but it's our refugee policy that solidifies that border. So there's been a lot of discussion just in the last week or so about the ending of the safe third country agreements between the United States and various Central American countries. Well, the longer term agreement, safe third country agreement, has been between Canada and the United States. And it basically means that almost no one can get to Canada if they've come through Mexico and the United States first. It's a way to use our geography and our policy to keep people away from the country. So Grahame has talked about all the different factors that are at play that are pushing, that are expelling people, really. The people are migrating to save themselves, to survive, and that this human mobility that we're seeing in caravans or individually is really fueled by a lot of desperation and fear that are tied to all sorts of issues like rising homicide rates, hunger, natural disasters, which we've, are continual, but most recently with the recent hurricanes and so on. And so I'll end with this final point, and then I'll turn it back to Rebecca and Grahame. But this is survival migration or refugee movement. This is a feature of our times that has a long history and a kind of a wider geography, that Canadians, as Grahame has said, are often connected to the root causes of this movement. And I've just shown you with one example with the Canadian extractive industry, that we are deeply implicated in all of this, and yet we're protected through the movement of people out of that region by our geography and through the refugee policies that we put in place. That so many other parts of the world bear the burden of hosting most refugees around the world. And it's almost impossible for many people from this region to find refuge in Canada. And certainly we're seeing that in the United States for similar and different reasons. But we are a party to international agreements that oblige us to respect the right for people to seek asylum and not turn people away at our borders. And we have been running counter to that for a long time now. And I think this is the push we need to see to both hold our companies accountable for what's happening, our politicians for facilitating and supporting that and not creating the accountability mechanisms we need in the law. And then also in terms of our refugee and immigration policy that really stops people from fleeing and receiving asylum in Canada. So I think that's it for me. I'm sure there's lots of people who are on the call who have done their own research in this region, have focused on different aspects of what we've talked about. And so I'm really interested to hear what people are reflecting on, or if they have questions of either of us. So I'll turn it back to you, Rebecca.
All right, great. Thank you both, Catherine and Grahame, for that really interesting presentation and important intervention at this current moment. You've generated a lot of really interesting points, and we've got quite a few questions that have been popping up. So I thought I would just take them sort of in the order in which they came.
Rebecca, so I'm just going to try and stop screen sharing, and then there we go. Great.
All right. So the first question we have here is, please tell us more about the situation and problems of the Garifuna in both Honduras and Guatemala.
I'll refer very briefly to the Garifuna in Honduras. But before I do that, I just want to connect one dot with picking up on a comment that Catherine really got into, and the whole notion of survival migrants. And it's been said before that refugee law does not allow for economic migrants. In fact, they're made fun of and they're denigrated. And my whole argument that I share with Catherine, and mining becomes an example of it, this is political violence. The resulting poverty, displacement from home and land by illegal evictions, etc., is political violence. And the policies are set at the national level in Guatemala and Honduras. They're set in Canada. They're set in the United States. They're set in the World Bank and the IMF. It's political violence that results in the deepening impoverishment of people, forcing them to flee. And then we turn around on the other side and say, go home, you're economic migrants. So again, I just wanted to connect those dots and reframe this stuff because it desperately needs reframing. The Grifina people in northern Honduras, who Rights Action I've worked with since the late 90s, are just one more example of this. We've heard mining related stories. This is now more recently a story related to tourism, let us say, or the production of African palm. But the Grifina people have an extraordinary history, and I won't go into the long history, but they're an African descendant, an American Indian descendant from the Caribbean islands, descendant indigenous people that has been surviving and living and thriving in some ways along what is now known as the North Shore of Honduras, and then south into Nicaragua and even down into Costa Rica a bit, and then north through Guatemala and up into Belize as the generations went by. But the majority of Garifuna people today live in what is known as Honduras, and mainly along the North Shore. And they've been treated deeply in a racist fashion by the Spanish colonial powers, and then the post, when Honduras became a nation state, they were the ruling sort of Spanish descendant elites have always treated the Garifuna people in a very racist and sort of oppressive way. But all of that has worsened in the last 30 or 40 years. And one example that I'll refer to is the tourism industry. I won't refer to the African palm industry, but it's another example that does the same. In the last 30 or 40 years, and particularly since the US and Canadian-backed coup in 2009, international tourism interests, there's some Italian private interests, there's interests that are funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, there's interests that are developed by private capital from Canada and the United States. They are using their partnerships with the corrupt local leaders in Honduras, with corrupt military, with the corrupt post-military coup regimes. They're using violence and corruption to forcibly evict Garifuna people to do what? To make way for the tourism industry, as one example. And so that's just one more example along the lines of what Catherine was saying. It's happening right now. It is Honduran regime policy. It is IDB policy. It is private investor in Canada policy. The Canadian government has brought tourism interests on government trips to come to Guatemala, to Honduras, to help in the mark of the framing of a free trade agreement with the post-military coup regime. Tourism operators were part of these business, political, government-to-government exchanges. The Canadian government knows all about Canadian tourism operators on the North Shore of Honduras. And it's contributing to all the same, in summary, all the very same things that Catherine mentioned, all the very same things that I referred to before. And it is contributing directly to why some people are being forced to flee home and country and go into exile, while other people who resist are being targeted for killings, disappearances, jailings, illegal jailings, etc. It's a very violent situation that's going on right now that's contributing. That's one more example of the very things we're discussing here today.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, please explain why San Pedro Sula has become a focus of violent crime and abuse in Honduras. Half a century ago, it had the reputation as being a prosperous, thriving, dynamic, agro-industrial and commercial city.
Rebecca, quick question before, because Graham will answer that one because of his work in Honduras, but can we find out who's actually asking the questions? That might help.
This is coming to us from Ray Bromley.
I'll give a very brief answer to that because I don't pretend to be an expert on microdynamics in San Pedro Sula itself, but I would question part of the question, and that is that a few generations ago, San Pedro Sula was a thriving economic hub of Honduras for whom? Because it was not a thriving, and it's never been a thriving economic hub for the majority of Honduran workers, even back then. It is one of the economic centers of Honduras, the richest lands in Honduras, like not the mineral lands where the mountains are, but the lowland producing lands where the sugarcane barrens are, the African palm barrens are, over a century of US banana companies, Standard Fruit, United Fruit, Dole Banana, Dole Pineapple, United Fruit Company in the old days before it got broken up as a monopoly not long after the coup in Guatemala. Like, they are the owners of the richest lands in northern Honduras, to simplify things. In more recent years, the World Bank's been a heavy investor in the African palm industry, with one of the largest landowners in Honduras, the Facusé family, that is one of the most corrupt, pro-military coup, violent families in all of Central America. They are that is the hub of the economy in northern Honduras. It was never a thriving economy for the exploited workers. It might have been a bit less violent 50 years ago than it is today, but that was never an economy that was built in function of the well-being of the local people, of the Honduran people. It's always been an economy that was built by force and corruption through US coups d'etats and supporting military regimes and dictators to produce goods cheaply, to then export them to international markets, as a generalization. And so that's part of my answer, is questioning the question. From there, Honduras has just gone from bad to way worse in the last 50 years, and particularly since the coup in 2009. And as all of the conditions and factors that we've been discussing get worse with the passing of time, and then after the coup in 2009, there's more desperate people, larger numbers of impoverished populations, large gang violence thrives in this context. There's more police corruption in Honduras today. Organized crime has infiltrated every branch of the Honduras state. Now, this was true before the coup, but it's multiplied by a factor of 10 or 100 since the coup. Organized crime, narco trafficking, stealing public funds, illegal businesses infiltrated with the state and the institutions of the state, the police, the military, the legislative branch, the judiciary, the executive branch, and there's trials going on in New York City related to narco trafficking linked directly to the president of Honduras. Organized crime has infiltrated everything. Organized crime also uses gangs as their killers. And so gangs are not an independent phenomenon in a place like Honduras, for example. They get linked into organized crime, and then the violence just spirals out of control. And Honduras is sadly, as violent a country as there is on the planet Earth today, related to all the historical factors that all got multiplied and accelerated by the coup in 2009. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. Our next question is from Lisa North. She says, congratulations for excellent overviews of the situation. Have you produced overview documents that might be available online?
The book.
The book. Well, we've put out reports from our emergency delegations that we operate, and they are mainly housed, I think, on the Rights Action website. But yeah, the main thing that we've been working towards is to get all of these, by the mining struggle. So in this book that has taken many turns, but is on its way to being out this coming summer, does focus on those four main mining struggles in the historical context of the genocide and kind of what we're living through now. And so each has an overview that includes, in a way it has an overview what's going on, but we invited people and reached out to a lot of people that we work with over the years. So each one of those chapters is made up of many voices, including our kind of opening of each chapter focused on La Puya, the Escobal mine, the Phoenix mine, and the Marlin mine, to include people from the community and their testimonies of what they've lived through, witnessed, and experienced. We have photographs from James Rodriguez of people from that region and sort of what's going on there. We have interviews with people that we sat down with, some lawyers and human rights organizations. And then we invited some journalists and other academics to give kind of fuller context as well for each one of those struggles. So, so hopefully we'll be able to share that with the CLAG community in the next few months.
And I would add, and it comes across as a plug, but it's not really a plug. But grassroots organizations getting on the listservs, following the social media and listservs, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Grassroots organizations. I don't mean that the little rights actions of the world, the breaking the silence in Canada, the Guatemala Human Rights Commission out of the U.S., NISCWA out of the U.S., CISPIS on El Salvador related issues, the Honduras Solidarity Network in Honduras, Witness for Peace. There's a large number of two-bit organizations, very small grassroots organizations. Our organizations have decades of history in places like Guatemala and Honduras. We don't get it right every time, but every one of our organizations is regularly putting out urgent actions, small analytical pieces, delegation reports addressing the wide range of issues. And fortunately, in the case of the work that Catherine and I have been doing together, a lot of that work is going to come together into one book. But you could write a similar book about tourism and the Garifuna people. All of our grassroots organizations, it's not like we are discovering this. We're in connection with grassroots groups like OFRANE, the main group that represents the Garifuna people. We help give voice to them. This is not some, oh, how great are we? But because we've been there, we've lived in country, we have the relationships, we're in funding relationships with them. We take their information, they know this is what we're doing, we translate it to English, we get it out there. All the work that Berta Cáceres was involved with COPIN in Honduras was the same relationship. I really think both the North American media, academics, scholars, NGOs, etc., should be on our news feeds. And again, it's not to say we get it right all the time, but we have small organizations spread around working on a wide range of different issues in these countries. And we're often at the forefront of denouncing things that are happening on the ground that otherwise this information would not be getting out there.
I just might add a thanks to Lisa North, because her co-edited book was one of the inspirations for me thinking about, reaching out to Grahame and thinking about how we might do a similar kind of a bringing many people together. So I'm glad you're on the call.
Great. Thank you both. Our next question is from Jorge Sodavia. What are your expectations for Honduran and Guatemalan migration and displacement after the effects of Hurricane Eta and Iota?
They're already at the border. They're already halfway across Mexico. I don't want to be too flippant about it, but it can only go from bad to worse. And again, let me pick up on this theme of so-called failed states. And it's a term that I reject in how it usually gets used in the North American context, political context, media context, even academic contexts. I don't think that they're failed states in Honduras and Guatemala. I think their elites know exactly what their states are doing. I think the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Canadian government, US government know exactly what those governments and states are doing. And they're doing things very intentionally that favor certain interests and ignore or disfavor other interests. So one of the things that they absolutely do not do, but it's choice, is they don't respond to COVID well in the pandemic of COVID. They don't respond to hurricanes well. They never have, they never will, because unless you change the underlying political structure and reform the state and society, because those are governments that are not interested in the well-being of their majority populations. They see their majority populations who are as exploitable labor or people who are in the way of quote unquote development. Again, that's a simplification and a generalization, but I don't think it's too much of an overgeneralization. And so there is no fundamental response from the governments of Honduras and Guatemala to the ravages of hurricanes Eta and Iota. This fell on a Little Rights Actions plate full time because we work in those regions of Honduras and in eastern Guatemala, and we were sending out tiny bits of money, as much as we could get our hands on, to people who were losing crops, losing homes, losing everything yet again. There was not then, and there will not be now, and there will not be in the near future any sort of substantive response from the Honduran and Guatemalan governments to the ravages of those two hurricanes, just to take that one example. It's not what they do. What do? all of last year, during the times of COVID and the hurricanes, they were supporting the continuation and the expansion of mining interests. They were forcibly evicting communities during COVID to make way for mining interests, African palm interests, etc. So it's a very active state in Guatemala and Honduras, but they're not active, to summarize, in terms of the well-being of the general population. They're active in terms of securing and promoting and enhancing a certain global economic order that is not a very fair and just economic order.
Yeah, one thing I might add is that obviously we can't be there and haven't been able to be there since last March. So the hurricane and COVID has happened since we were there. And so Grahame has, of course, those ongoing conversations with folks on the ground there, but also we're relying as well on the relationships we have with a lot of both NGOs and journalists on the ground who are sharing that information with us. So someone like, I would encourage people to listen to Karen Spring with the Honduras Solidarity Network, who has a podcast that comes out called Honduras Now. Excellent on the ground reporting to share, and some of the more recent episodes have had to do with the kind of impact of the hurricanes and COVID as well. And then good people we work with from Prensa Comunitaria, from lots of freelance journalists, Sandra Cuff, Jeff Abbott, and others who are reporting from the region. We rely on them to really fill in for us what we can't be there to document right now. But what they are showing is both that people are continuing to flee in great numbers, but also they're documenting the ways in which people are trying to not flee. So the way in which communities are trying to figure out ways to recover in the absence of any sort of state support.
Thank you. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. What is the role of neoliberal agrarian policies on increasing vulnerabilities / refugee creating conditions in Guatemala?
Everything?
Go ahead.
I mean, the neoliberal policies, whether it's around the agro-food industry, whether it's mining, whether it's tourism, the opening up of the whole region really to international investment, which itself is not bad, but the conditions have been created so that we also see that it used to be that there had to be some partial ownership. There might be some opportunity for something local to percolate into some of that investment. And now we're at a stage where it can be 100% international owned. So decisions are being made in whether it's in New York City or Toronto or Vancouver or in London, and with players on the ground who, I don't know, what we're seeing now is there are a lot of people who were part of the internal conflicts, the wars with communities are now those very players who were hired as private investment or private security for these companies to violently impose this model, which is counter to, pro-community, pro-water, pro-women, pro-families, that they are being brought on to impose this model that's not new, but I think it's just being amplified now. Grahame?
These are the very points that I think we've both been trying to make, and mining's an example of it. When you ask a specific question about neoliberalism, for me, that's just another way of saying that what I was trying to say earlier on, that this is policies set in by international actors, by the US government, the Canadian government through free trade agreements, by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank on their demands they make of local states before they're going to give them a loan, by the IMF when it does its structural adjustment reforms, and whether it's going to help a country depends on certain reforms. All of that can loosely fall under the umbrella of neoliberalism, global free market economy, whatever you want to call it. All of that is at the heart and center, at the root cause of so much of the violence and corruption, forced displacement, and people being forced into exile. And that neoliberal model in places like Guatemala and Honduras is deeply characterized by corruption, from the local level to the national level to the global levels. It's characterized by impunity. There is no justice whenever violence occurs, when crimes occur, when human rights violations occur. There's no justice at the local, national, or global levels. It's deeply characterized by exploitation. That model uses people as cheap labor at best, or uses violence to get them off their land, to use the best lands to then produce goods for export. I'm starting to repeat myself, but the neoliberal model itself is part of the problem. But that is Canadian government policy, that is US government policy, that is World Bank IDB policy. And that's why I try to use that as an example of the reframing of what are the underlying causes of producing so many refugees. Those policies, as implemented corruptly and violently, directly contribute to refugee flight and forced migrancy. Oh, sorry, and I jotted this down to give an example of that, and picking up on what Catherine said, it's not about investment per se. For years, the Garifuna people on the North Shore of Honduras will say, we have no problem with tourism. Just stop using violence and corruption to steal our lands, to then set up and build your own hotels, and you be the owners in the hotels, and maybe hire a few Garifuna people as cheap labor to give a local cultural flavor to your restaurant. We have no problem with tourism. We want people to come and visit our hotels, our restaurants, and our beaches, and respect our language and learn from us and share with us. So the question about neoliberalism goes to the heart and center of what is this global economic model that sort of characterizes so much of the entire planet, the neoliberal model, as opposed to what would be an alternative. All the people in the communities that Catherine and I have worked in on the mining side, the Garifuna people, they have very clear visions of what economic development would look like. Who would be the owners of their lands? Who would be the people to protect their local environment? Who would be the owners of their local business? They want ownership. They want businesses. They want investment, but they want to be the owners and the people responsible for taking care of the well-being of their own people, their land, and their Mother Earth, and not be just sort of people in the way of the global economy, producing for faraway consumers and faraway investors, or cheap labor for that same model. And that gets to the heart and center of what a lot of this discussion is about, and why so many people are forced to flee Honduras and Guatemala decade after decade.
Thank you. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. How is growing debt fueling migration for communities?
That's an interesting one. I wish RJ Johnson was on the call and he could answer. I know that's something that he is studying, particularly in the highlands of Guatemala, the way in which people have had to take on debt in order to send somebody north. And when caught in the detention camps, caught up at the border, deported back and so on, no ability to pay those debts back has, again, just intensified the difficulty that families are living with. And I direct people to RJ's work on that and others, but I think that's some really important work. The role of debt is a much bigger issue for all sorts of countries around the world, and one that traps many people into these schemes, neoliberal schemes that we're seeing play out now, that all have a foundation in the debt taken on by previous administrations, previous presidents and their governments and so on, that they're not getting out of. And I think it's an issue that we need to pay a lot more attention to. And then on the micro scale, at the level of the family, I think what we're seeing is that it's playing out in really terrible ways in communities where people are losing the lands that they have, the small houses they have, maybe small businesses, in an effort to send somebody north, which oftentimes now is met with detention and deportation. Our
next question is from Mary Jo McConaughey. I think this is something very much on people's minds. What might the new Biden administration do first to greatest effect to support people's efforts to stay on their homelands?
Ooh, I might let Grahame answer that one, but I will say hello to Mary Jo. We've never met, but I so appreciate your writing, your reporting, and I'm really glad you're on the call. I'll see if Grahame has something he wants to start with.
Well, I'll say hi, Mary Jo, as well. That goes to the heart and center of what I was trying to frame as the underlying problem on the macro level. There's no doubt, like I am appreciative that Biden has done the complete about face from his time in office with Obama, and is now advocating openly for a pathway to citizenship for some 11 million people. I don't know how that'll play itself out, and I suspect that if there's not strong activism inside the US and NGOs, church groups, progressive politicians, that he may even waver on that. And that was certainly not the policies of the 8 years of Obama governments when Biden was vice president. They were deporting more people than any government up to that time. Obama was referred to critically, in a very critical manner, as the deporter in chief, and the numbers bear that out. And that was Biden's time in office as a vice president. So I am very appreciative that he has shifted completely on that and is providing this pathway to citizenship, and I hope it comes to pass. But all of that, as I said earlier, begs the question on will the US change? And the US is the big elephant in the room in Central America. I do insist always that Canada is part of the issue and part of the problem. The World Bank is part of the problem, though the World Bank is dominated by the US. The IMF is part of the problem, but it's dominated, not completely, but significantly by the US. And then multinational corporations all have their hand in the till and are profiting significantly with their operations in places like Honduras and Guatemala and contributing to this same morass. But the big elephant in the room is the United States. And the big question for the United States going forward and these other actors is, will they change their underlying policies towards governments like Honduras and Guatemala or not? Will they change their underlying policies towards this global economic order, the neoliberal economic order, or not? I see no signs of them changing their approach to either of those things at all. And I believe that, sadly, that in the near future, people will be fleeing Honduras and Guatemala at the same rates, perhaps not as extreme. Perhaps they will dip down. Honduras is a complicated case because of narco-trafficking President Juan Orlando Hernandez, and what Biden's government will they stand by that, even that president? I don't know. The numbers may go down a bit, but until you change the underlying political and economic structures in both those countries that benefit these international actors, that's kept in place by these international actors, then it's hard to see that the underlying conditions will be changed drastically. I fear that.
I might just add something just connected to that question and what Grahame's answering, but tying it to what we're talking about in the Canadian context as well, and what we're asking really moving forward with, again, a new administration. One thing I think that Canada could do tomorrow, which many organizations and people across the country, is to end the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. That could have an immediate transformation. So at the moment, and for the last 15 years or so, folks from Central America, almost the only way they could claim asylum is to get on an airplane and make their way to the Toronto Pearson Airport. If you stop anywhere in between, so coming on foot, coming on train, coming on any of the many ways that people flee this region, they are immediately sent back to the United States. They cannot make a claim in Canada, and that is so counter to the myth that Canada is a refugee welcoming country. And we have set it up so that people cannot do that. So that could have an immediate impact by ending that agreement and reinitiating an understanding of what people are facing in the region and how Canada could contribute not only to protect those who do need out, who need a safety valve, And it might not be forever, but for some time, as has happened in the past. And the other is grappling with our corporations and setting up the legal conditions to hold these companies accountable. We have some civil cases, but criminally, it's not possible. And many people should be in jail for what's gone on. And so I think there's kind of parallels to what might happen in the United States and changes that will happen there. But I think there's lots that we as Canadians can be pushing on as well.
Great, yes, and I think I saw that Erica Henderson is also on the call, and she asked a very similar question later on, so you went ahead and answered.
Hi, Erica.
So another question from Mary Jo is, along with the US and Canada, is China or another country becoming a player in mining or other extractive projects?
That is a good question. I don't know in Guatemala, Honduras, Graham?
Well, there are other countries, and there are companies from other countries. And the book, in this book that we're finally getting published, it's had quite a wrinkle that we haven't discussed, and that it was, we had a publishing contract pulled by Springer Publishing Company at the last minute, and we believe that it was due to corporate pressures, and we had to investigate this, denounce this, and we scrambled around and got another publisher. That book deals mainly with Guatemala and mainly, but not exclusively, Canadian companies, though some of them are Canadian, US companies, et cetera. And then, so then to build back through to the question, the next big player in Guatemala today is a Swiss-based company with a lot of Russian capital. So this is the struggle in Eastern Guatemala related to the long history that Catherine mentioned of, first it was Inco, the Canadian nickel mining giant, and then it was Sky Resources Hudbay, picking up the nickel mining interests of Inco, and now there's these precedent-setting lawsuits in Canadian courts related to Hudbay and Sky Resources. When Hudbay sold its interests after some 50+ years of Canadian ownership, they sold it to a Swiss company, Solway Investment Group, with a lot of Russian capital, and this company is doing exactly the same thing that the 50 years of Canadian companies did. Acting corruptly, acting violently, forced evictions, illegal criminalizations of activists, community defenders, journalists, etc. There is simply no change in how they're carrying out their operations on the ground in Guatemala. And that is the nature of doing business in Guatemala. And I think one of the things that our work and certainly the book tries to denounce is that this is the nature of Honduras and Guatemala. And all of these international actors, governments, intergovernment agencies, and private corporations know that that is the nature of a place like Guatemala, and they take advantage of it, and they directly participate in the corruption, in the violence, in the repression, and recreate those very same conditions that we've been talking about.
I might throw in one anecdote, because we always used to bring our findings after delegations and field schools and so on to the Canadian Embassy to meet with either the ambassador, the trade attachés, and so on. And something that often they would throw out is, well, at least they're not, Chinese miners. They're not Chinese-owned mining companies doing this. Wouldn't it be so much worse? And here we are bringing murders, rapes, forced evictions, and on and on and on. And we said, it doesn't matter, actually, but it does matter that we're here at the Canadian Embassy talking about an embassy that's facilitating these Canadian mining companies in the face of all of this knowledge. It's not unknown that the way in which these companies are operating.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. So our next one, and this may be our last, we have about 7 minutes left in total, so we're starting to near the end of our time, is from Carla McCall. Thank you for the presentation. What do you think research can do to generate discussions and action against family separation / zero tolerance policies at the US-Mexico border?
Well, all we can do is do our best and do what we do. And what I've always said is that what we do in our research, when we're highlighting these testimonies, actually amplifying the voices of people that we're meeting with, documenting these experiences, is to not only witness it, but to speak out against it. And so I think, as you know, from my side as academics, it doesn't end with writing a research article, but it's figuring all the different ways in which we can share this information, how to engage with our politicians, in Canada, our MPs and so on, as they're making decisions, bring those voices. I think often what I tell students I work with is we need to know the big picture, we need to know the statistics, we need to know the broad picture, but it's keeping the human face in front of all of this to really amplify what's happening, and that we're kind of a conduit. We're, you know, people are sharing this with us, and so that, yeah, it's our job to get it out there in as many ways as we can. So things like Grahame and I recently, it's been podcasts, it's been interviews, it's working with journalists, it's engaging with lots of different people so that, you know, something resonates somewhere along the way.
And I'll finish off sort of reiterating a few things I've said, which I don't think will be surprising to anyone. And that is, it's in terms of research and what focus to bring it, it's the same human, caring, moving focus on the plight of the refugees that's already happening, but it is reframing the underlying conditions. It would be my last 2 cents worth, which will be no surprise to anyone. And we need to redefine these issues, in my view, as these are not Canadian, these are not Guatemalan and Honduran issues. These are our issues as well, through our policies, through the things that Catherine and I have been talking about. And the roots of this go back hundreds of years. The boot print, the footprint of the weight of the US in Central America is unfathomable, going back hundreds of years. And so it's the reframing of what are the underlying causes and what are the, who has the underlying responsibility. The defining of the suffering itself, there's very, very good work already being done on that, and more of it should be done. The ripping apart of families, the children-parent separation, the sending parents back across the border while the kids stay in the United States, some of them in cages. Like that stuff, you can't report on it enough. But to reframe it as, this is not a Guatemalan or a Honduran or even a Mexican issue. These are local to global human issues. And our governments are not only part of the treatment when those people show up at our borders, but we are part of creating the underlying conditions that force them to flee in the first place. They're not nation state issues. These are global human issues. And the accountability for changing policies has to come home as well to Canada and the US private and public sector. That's how I would end off. And I appreciate very much all the CLAG folks for this opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Catherine and Grahame, so much. This was such an interesting conversation, and thank you to all of the attendees for your wonderful questions. I wish that we were able to get through all of them. I see there are quite a few that are raised some really interesting points as well. If only we could stay longer, but for now, I will just say thank you for this wonderful discussion. I know I really learned a lot from it, and I will turn it over to Jim to tell us a bit more about the next CLAG Live event. Thanks, Rebecca.
I can only reiterate what Rebecca just stated. And again, thank you to Grahame, Catherine, and Rebecca for their time and for their contributions. Thank you to the nearly, I think we had over 100 people between our live stream on YouTube and Zoom here. So thank you to everybody who made time to connect as well. Live CLAG isn't going away. We have a session next week, we have a session the following week, and a session the following week. So you will be getting the endless stream of emails from me, for which I apologize for ahead of time. But our session next week is entitled Climate Risk, Food Systems, and Epistemological Diversity. How can ecological knowledge improve resilience in Latin America? Hopefully you will be able to participate. I look forward to seeing everybody. And if Grahame and Catherine are amenable and they'd like to provide a link or two to any relevant information or research, I can include that with the video of this webinar that I will be uploading to our YouTube channel in the next day or two. Okay? So again, thank you to everybody who participated, and I look forward to seeing you next time around. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank you very
all.
much.